So we are going to go ahead and kick things off with the Will It Work For Me series. And in this training module, we are talking about the neuropharmacology of psilocybin, how it physically works in the brain. And so I am going to go ahead for this. I've got a couple of diagrams that I want you to be able to see. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will go from there. Okay, so you might have already watched our free basic informational video where I explained how psilocybin physically works in the brain. I've got a bunch of free content all around our website and YouTube and all of that. But if you didn't, this is called neuropharmacology, right? So I am going to briefly repeat it here and ensure that you have all this info because it's very, very crucial to understanding and buying into how this treatment works just in general. Now, psilocybin is a naturally occurring compound that's found in over 200 species of wild mushrooms that grow pretty much all around the world, right? And I've included this map here just so you can kind of see like where the populations are located of all these different species. The psilocybin molecule itself is classified as a tryptamine. So this is a type of molecule that can also be made from the amino acid tryptophan. Tryptophan, in fact, is the sole precursor to the neurotransmitter and hormone serotonin, which you probably have heard of. The most important thing to know is that psilocybin mimics serotonin. And actually, psilocybin is not bioactive in and of itself. Our liver and our small intestine removes a phosphate group from psilocybin, and this turns it into something called psilocin, right? So psilocin is actually the bioactive form of psilocybin, and without that phosphate group, the molecule can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. So if you hear psilocybin and psilocin, they're very similar, but it's psilocin that mimics serotonin because it looks almost identical to serotonin. And I've included a diagram here so that you can see the molecular structure. You can tell that psilocybin over here is much more complex. It's got this phosphate group over here. The psilocin then does not have that phosphate group, and you can see how similar this is to the neurotransmitter serotonin. Now, if you don't know much about serotonin, it is a prolific neurotransmitter and hormone in both the mind and the gut, right? And there are several different receptor subtypes that all do slightly different things. Psilocybin has a special affinity for a receptor subtype called the 2A receptor subtype. And so it stands to reason that wherever these 2A receptors are most dense, that's where psilocybin would work the strongest, right? Well, the 2A receptors just happen to be exceptionally dense in two structures of the brain that are responsible for a lot of core mental health afflictions today. And that would be the default mode network and the limbic system. Now, psilocybin physically changes these areas of the brain, right? Temporarily for about 5 to 6 hours. The half-life of psilocybin is 3 hours, just so you know. Contrast that with caffeine, whose half-life is 6 hours. So psilocybin actually works pretty rapidly in the body as compared to some other common substances that you might know, like cannabis or caffeine or alcohol, etc. So during this time, I included this diagram, during this time, it increases brain activity and brain communication exponentially. And it's important to know that it increases global brain communication, but there are some localized areas where it actually suppresses, such as in the default mode network. And we'll get into that in just a second. The limbic system is back here in the back of the brain. This is where trauma and fear are stored. And it's often responsible for people with chronic anxiety who are always, scanning the horizon, right? They're waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under them. They're just kind of stuck in fight or flight mode. These are people who are jumpy with loud noises from, say, PTSD. These are people who might have extreme social anxiety or fear of being around people. These are people who have OCD, right? All of these people tend to have overactive limbic systems, in particular the amygdala. Psilocybin goes in during the session itself and it quiets this fear center. It literally suppresses amygdala activity. So people who are suffering from an overactive, constantly lighting up amygdala will get immediate relief and kind of a reset effect, right, in this limbic system. So this tends to produce what I call a fear extinction response, where the fear that you have is decoupled from memories, right? So what makes trauma to one person is not what makes trauma to a different person, right? Two people could see the same event, such as, this is a horrific example, an animal getting hit on a road, right? And if you don't know that animal, you might say, oh, how terrible. But if that is your beloved kitten that you just bought, that might be stored as trauma, as opposed to being stored as an unfortunate memory that you soon forget about, right? So this is what makes trauma. So getting back to this for a second, so this when psilocybin comes in here and does this, it decouples the fear from the memory. It allows the memory to be properly grieved and released, and then it reintegrates it back in to the holistic timeline of a person's life. So this is one area that psilocybin works quite remarkably in. And here's a little thing about the limbic system processes and what it does. And this is from the Cleveland Clinic, as you can see. All right, the default mode network, let's talk about that. While the limbic system is a very specific structure, the default mode network isn't a region. It's more of like a highway. It's the brain's superhighway. This is a structure inside the brain that's responsible for all of your autobiographical thoughts and beliefs, things like I'm not worthy of love or I'm a bad person, right? As well as ruminating thought patterns. And studies show that people with depression, anxiety tend to have extremely active default mode networks, meaning they're ruminating all the time, which can also make it extremely hard to focus and can lead to actually an ADHD misdiagnosis in some situations. So as we all know, people who ruminate, they know ruminating is a destructive cycle, right? Because the more that you ruminate on a particular thought or belief, especially if it's harmful, the more deeply ingrained it becomes. It's like driving on a muddy road or skiing in, ski tracks down a slope. The more you do that, the ruts just keep getting deeper and deeper. And so this is why people who by midlife say that they feel completely stuck, it's in their thought patterns, right? They might feel powerless to get up out of those ridges because their thought patterns have just become so rigid that they have no wiggle room at all for just thinking different thoughts or changing those harmful beliefs or replacing those harmful beliefs. A lot of times that got programmed in childhood. In adulthood, you can find it next to impossible to replace that harmful belief with a more positive, affirming belief. So psilocybin, or bioactive form, psilocin, it quiets the default mode network, right? It comes in and it physically suppresses it and it takes it offline for a while. And so that effectively dissolves those ruts. So it would be kind of like a heavy rain, right? In my analogy earlier, the heavy rain comes in, it just takes away the ruts on a muddy road and it just makes it all equal again. So people end up having this break-free experience where they find intense freedom in their own thoughts again, right? And then they can work to reprogram their brains in a way by replacing those harmful thoughts with positive, helpful ones. So here's just a little diagram, right, about the default mode network and kind of like how it works in the brain. The last thing I want to talk about is psilocybin as a psychoplastogen. This is super, super exciting, and there's a lot more emerging research around this. Psilocybin is considered a psychoplastogen. This is a term that's used to describe compounds that promote neuroplasticity. This is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. So this concept is particularly relevant in the context of mental health, right? Because a lot of psychiatric disorders are actually associated with impaired neuroplasticity or overly rigid brain patterns. So let's just talk a little bit more about this before we close out this portion of the training. Neuroplasticity really refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt in response to new experiences, learning, or even injury. So this process involves the formation of new synapses, the strengthening or weakening of existing synapses, or even the growth of new neurons, which is called neurogenesis. Now, psychoplastogens are a class of compounds that can rapidly promote these neuroplastic changes, and they have gained attention for their potential to treat or help alleviate various mental health conditions by reversing the neural atrophy, and synaptic disconnection that is associated with these disorders. We've already discussed that psilocybin mimics serotonin in the human body and in the brain, and it binds to 2A serotonin receptors. Activation of these receptors is what initiates a cascade of events that promote this neuroplasticity. So it's important to know that this neuroplasticity and neurogenesis happens in particular in areas of the brain where there's 2A receptor subtypes are so abundant, because that's primarily where psilocybin acts. So psilocybin has been shown to increase levels of BDNF. This is also called brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a protein that supports the survival, growth, and differentiation of neurons. So higher BDNF levels are associated with improved synaptic plasticity and improved cognitive function as well. Studies have also demonstrated that psilocybin can lead to structural changes in the brain, like increased dendritic growth, and spine density in the prefrontal cortex. Now, dendrites are those branched extensions, right, of neurons that receive the synaptic inputs, and increased spine density suggests an enhanced synaptic connectivity. So psilocybin promotes the formation of these new synapses, which can help restore neural circuits. And sometimes these circuits are disrupted in conditions like depression and PTSD. So that's the connection there. Psilocybin also causes functional brain changes, right? This isn't just a placebo effect. It increases connectivity between the global brain regions, as we discussed earlier, and it facilitates communication between areas that don't typically interact. So this can lead to more flexible and adaptive thinking patterns, even long after your actual psychedelic session. And we've already discussed the reduced default mode network activity, right? So the default mode network is often overactive in individuals with depression and anxiety, as we've discussed. Psilocybin's ability to reduce the default mode network activity can disrupt the maladaptive rumination, and it can promote healthier cognitive processes, again, over time. Psilocybin helps promote structural and functional neurochanges in the brain that can help reset maladaptive neural circuits. And so this, with the partnership, right, of conscious effort, which is also called integration. Integration is what happens after your session as you go back to living your daily life. These two things can lead to permanent improvements in mood, cognition, and behavior. Now, I want to talk just briefly, I think this is about the end. I want to talk about psilocybin versus other treatment methods, right? Other mental health tools. So medication works by managing symptoms. It can be fast acting, but a lot of people get stuck on their medications. And then over time, it can become inadequate. A lot of people come to us who have been on SSRIs for years or decades, and their SSRIs have stopped working. It's called SSRI failure, right? The brain is just like, I don't want this medication anymore. I've adapted. It doesn't even work anymore. So I think medications can be very helpful for addressing short-term needs, but they're not really meant to like heal things permanently, especially that are dealing with the inner psyche. Talk therapy provides human support and teaches new coping tools, right? And we partner with so many therapists in the Portland metro area to really help clients get the most value from both programs. Talk therapy sometimes can be slow, right? As many people know, and it also can be limited in comprehensive healing due to the inability to access certain parts of the brain where trauma is stored, right? Like the limbic system. So most talk therapy programs use some sort of cognitive therapy that happens in the prefrontal cortex, where you learn about what happened, you know why or how, and you're thinking about it and you're processing it, but it's not necessarily accessing. You're not necessarily feeling healed, right? You can't think your way to healing, especially trauma, because it doesn't live there and because the nervous system is dysregulated. You can't tell your nervous system to just become regulated. Your nervous system cares about feeling safe and feeling centered. And so that's what happens in a psychedelic session is you actually can bring your nervous system out of dysregulation and into a more regulated, calm, and peaceful state. And then finally, I want to talk about ketamine. This is a dissociative anesthetic that leads to a rapid reduction of mental suffering while you are in the session. This is why it's appropriate for people, for example, who are having suicidal impulses. However, because ketamine sessions are usually fairly short and because they do not work in the same active coping mechanism as what psilocybin does, symptoms will sometimes rapidly bounce back in the days or weeks following a ketamine session. And so most often, ketamine providers will require someone to come in for a series of 4 or 6 treatments, and then afterwards you have to have regular ongoing maintenance for, the foreseeable future, right? And so over time, ketamine is very promising, but it also can get very expensive if you look at like a total annual cost of the treatment. And then finally, psilocybin therapy, right? This is an intensive, disruptive type of therapy. It is not meant to be something that you do all the time, but it does require preparation, it requires readiness, and it requires full engagement along with a commitment to self-care afterwards. So for clients who are really committed to this process, one session, a lot of times because we custom dose every single person, we go through a whole, like a dozen questions to determine what their appropriate dose is. This really fits the client's needs, right, when they go through that. And so one session is often enough to really resolve considerable mental health symptoms such as depression and anxiety.